The night air was heavy with silence when he found her, crouched by the barn with her face buried in her hands, tears cutting through the dust on her cheeks. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, vast and merciless, but in that small corner of the world, her sorrow was louder than the howl of any coyote. She thought no one would notice her there, hidden in the shadow of wooden planks weathered by years of wind and toil. Yet, fate had a way of leading two broken souls into the same silence. And when the farmer stopped before her, his boots sinking into the dirt, the words he spoke carried more weight than gold. He offered not comfort, not coin, but his very last name. In the Old West, names were more than letters spoken aloud. A name was survival, a shield against a world where law was often written with bullets. To offer someone your name was to bind your fate to theirs, to stake your claim not on land or cattle, but on loyalty. For a woman alone, crying by the barn, it meant the difference between fading into the forgotten dust or becoming part of something greater than herself. His gesture was not of pity, but of defiance against loneliness, against the cruelty of the frontier. She lifted her gaze, her eyes swollen from weeping, and in the dim light of the lantern he carried, she saw no hesitation in his face. He was not a rich man, nor a man with promises of comfort. He was weathered, scarred by years of harvest lost and night survived. But in his gaze burned something more enduring than wealth, a conviction that even in the unforgiving silence of the West, no soul should be left to fight alone. His offer was not romance spoken in poetry, but survival carved out of truth. The barn stood tall behind her, a symbol of work and sweat, of endless days under the sun. Yet in that moment, it became something else, a witness to a turning point. She could remain the girl abandoned to her tears, nameless in the eyes of the world, or she could rise with a new strength, carrying a name that tethered her to a man who had chosen her in the most unexpected of ways. In the West, choices came suddenly, and each one could alter the course of destiny forever. And so, what began as a night of despair cracked open into the possibility of a new beginning. The dust beneath them seemed to pause, the wind itself waiting for her answer. For in a land where survival demanded sacrifice, the farmer's words held more power than any oath sworn before men. He had given her a name, a chance to belong, and in that fragile moment by the barn, two stories that had been unraveling alone threatened to weave themselves into one. The barn smelled of hay and rain-soaked wood, a reminder of seasons that had passed with more loss than harvest. She sat there, her body trembling, clutching her arms as though trying to hold herself together. The farmer, still standing at a distance, felt the weight of her silence heavier than any burden he had carried in the fields. He was a man who had spent years fighting droughts, wolves, and the relentless demands of the land, but nothing struck him harder than the sight of a soul so completely broken. In the West, strength was currency, and weakness was often buried before dawn. Yet here, before him, was a truth he could not walk past. Her tears glistened in the faint glow of the lantern, and with every drop, he saw a reflection of his own past. He, too, had known nights of solitude, nights where the prairie stretched so wide it seemed to swallow even the sound of his breath. To offer her his last name was not an act of charity, but an act of recognition. The recognition that survival meant more than feeding one's body. It meant feeding one's spirit with the presence of another. Alone, both of them would crumble. Together, perhaps, they stood a chance. She looked at him with disbelief, as though his words were a cruel joke. In a world where men often sought to take, here was one offering instead. But she quickly realized there was no mockery in his voice, no shadow of deceit in his eyes. The weight of his offer shook her more than the loneliness had. For in the West, to take a man's name was to step into his life, his hardships, and his battles. It was a gamble, but then again, everything in this land was. The barn door rattled in the wind, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire night waited on her reply. She thought of the road behind her, the rejection, the hunger, the cruel stares of those who saw her as less than nothing. That road offered only more of the same. Ahead of her stood a man who was flawed, weathered, and hardened by the soil, but he had given her something no one else dared, a place to belong. Her heart raced as the choice settled deep within her bones. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin, nearly drowned by the night wind. "Why me?" she asked. And though her words trembled, they carried the echo of her deepest fear, that she was too broken, too lost to be chosen for anything but pity. The farmer's reply was steady, like the earth beneath their feet. "Because I see you, and that is enough." Those words pierced the silence, rewriting the story she thought had ended before it began. Morning broke with a pale light stretching across the fields, painting the world in golden shadow. She rose from the barn, her eyes swollen, but her spirit steadier than it had been in years. The farmer was already at work, his figure moving through the field with the steady rhythm of someone who had long surrendered himself to routine. Yet now, every swing of his tool, every step in the soil, carried a different weight, for he no longer worked for himself alone. The thought of her inside his world gave meaning to the back-breaking labor. She watched him from a distance, still unsure of her place. The farmhouse stood tall yet empty, a structure that echoed with loneliness. Its windows seemed to look at her, waiting to know if she would claim them as her own. The West did not forgive hesitation, but for her, hesitation had been survival. Every decision before had cost her something: family, safety, dignity. But here, hesitation felt different. It was not about fear of loss, but about the possibility of finally belonging. As the day stretched on, he returned to the house, his face flushed from the sun, his clothes soaked with sweat. She waited at the door, her hand gripping the frame, torn between stepping aside to let him pass or standing as though to claim her place there. When their eyes met, no words were spoken, but both knew the meaning. She had not left. In the West, that alone was a declaration. Survival was not about running, but about standing when the land itself tried to drive you away. That night, they shared a meal at the worn wooden table, the creak of the chairs filling the silence where conversation struggled to grow. It was a simple dinner: bread, beans, and water, but it carried the weight of something far richer. For the first time in years, neither of them ate alone. Every bite reminded her that loneliness had been the true hunger all along. The farmer watched her cautiously, as though afraid she would vanish if he looked away, but she stayed, her presence more powerful than any promise. The wind outside howled across the prairie, but inside the farmhouse, something fragile had begun to take root. Neither of them called it love, for love in the West was too delicate a word to survive. Instead, it was recognition, the bond of two souls who had walked too long in silence and had finally found someone to listen. It was not safety nor certainty, but it was enough to light a small fire against the vast darkness pressing at their walls. The days unfolded slowly, each one shaped by routine, yet carrying the quiet presence of change. She began to find her rhythm within the farmhouse, sweeping the dust from its corners, patching worn fabric, mending what had long been left untouched. It was not the work itself that mattered, but the life it breathed into the hollow rooms. The farmer noticed it too, though he said little. He simply watched the way the silence shifted when she moved through the house, softer now, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for her. Outside, the prairie remained as merciless as ever. The sun beat down on the fields, scorching the soil that refused to yield its crops. Coyotes prowled at night, their cries haunting the horizon, while whispers of raiders passing through nearby towns reached even their quiet homestead. Yet amid these threats, there was a fragile peace between them. They had not yet spoken of promises, but their unspoken bond grew stronger with every dawn. One evening, she found herself standing in the doorway, watching him return from the fields. His shoulders were bent from the day's toil, his hands raw from gripping the plow, but his steps were steady, purposeful. For a moment, she saw more than a farmer. She saw a man carrying the weight of survival, the kind of strength the West demanded from anyone who dared to remain. And though he walked alone across the field, she realized he was no longer truly alone. Their conversations were few, their words plain and practical, but there was meaning in the smallest of gestures. When he passed her the last slice of bread without speaking, when she left water on the table before he came in from the heat, when their eyes met and lingered just long enough to say what neither dared to voice, These were the beginnings of something unspoken yet undeniable. In the West, where life was often cut short, it was not grand declarations that mattered, but small acts of endurance. That night, as the fire cracked in the hearth, she allowed herself to exhale fully for the first time in years. The barn where she had once wept felt like another life. She was still uncertain, still scarred, but within these walls she had begun to glimpse something she thought she had lost forever, the faint outline of belonging. And though the West could tear it away at any moment, she clung to it with a strength she did not know she had. But peace in the West was always fragile, like glass resting on the edge of a table. It could shatter without warning. One morning, the distant sound of hooves carried across the plains, a thunder that grew closer with each passing moment. The farmer stiffened as soon as he heard it, his hand instinctively reaching for the shotgun leaning by the door. She froze, her body tightening with a fear she thought she had left behind. Raiders. Or worse. He turned to her with eyes sharp and steady. "If trouble comes," he said quietly, "you stand with me, not behind me." The words shocked her. She had expected him to tell her to hide, to stay silent, to vanish into the corners of the farmhouse. But instead, he placed her beside him, not as a burden, but as an equal. His trust was heavier than the weapon he placed in her hands. For a moment, she trembled, but then she gripped it tight. If this was her place now, she would defend it. The riders passed on the horizon, their figures dark against the rising sun, their voices carrying rough laughter. They did not turn toward the farm, but the message was clear. Danger was never far, and peace was only ever borrowed time. When the sound finally faded into the distance, the farmhouse seemed to breathe again. But she knew, as he did, that they would have to be ready for the day the riders did not pass them by. That evening, when the sky burned with streaks of crimson and gold, she stood outside with the rifle still in her hands. The weight no longer felt foreign. It felt like part of her, a symbol of the choice she had made when she stayed. She was no longer the woman crying alone by the barn. She was someone who had been given a name, and now she carried the responsibility that came with it. In the West, names were defended not only with words, but with steel and fire. The farmer joined her, his silence heavy but not cold. Together they stood, side by side, watching the endless horizon. The danger was real, the uncertainty constant, but so too was their resolve. The barn, the farmhouse, the fields, they were no longer just his. They were theirs. And though the West could take everything at any moment, tonight, they stood unbroken. The days that followed carried a tension that neither of them spoke aloud. Every creak of the windmill, every howl in the distance, seemed sharper than before. Yet beneath that unease, something deeper was growing, a bond forged not in comfort, but in the constant knowledge that tomorrow was never promised. She woke each morning to the sound of his boots on the wooden floor, and found in that rhythm a strange comfort. Life was still harsh, but now was shared. She began to learn the rhythms of the land. Her hands, once hesitant, grew stronger with each task. She fed the animals, drew water, even took to the fields when the sun was high and the soil refused to yield. The farmer watched quietly, offering little praise, but his silence was no longer cold. It was filled with respect. He had given her his name, but she was proving every day that she was worthy of it. One evening, as they sat at the table, she broke the silence. "Do you ever regret staying?" she asked, her voice low, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire. He looked at her, the weight of years heavy in his eyes. "Every man regrets something," he said, "but leaving would have meant regret for the rest of my life. Staying gave me a chance, even if it's only a hard one." His words settled in her chest, not as comfort, but as truth. His honesty struck her. She realized that survival in the West was not about choosing the easiest path. It was about choosing the one that allowed you to keep a piece of yourself alive. For him, it was the land, the soil he had bled into. For her, it was the chance to no longer be invisible. Their paths had collided in hardship, and together they had built something that could not be measured by wealth or land. As the fire burned low, she felt a quiet shift within herself. She was no longer the woman begging for a place by the barn. She was someone who had found strength in the act of staying. The West had taken much from her, but it had also given her this, a name, a place, and a reason to rise each morning. And in that realization, she felt a spark of belonging she had thought forever lost. But the West was never still. The quiet was always temporary, and storms brewed even under clear skies. One afternoon, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the plains. The farmer froze mid-step, his hand instinctively moving toward the shotgun. She followed him outside, the sun glaring hot above them, the horizon stretching endlessly. Somewhere out there, another family was fighting for survival, and the sound carried a warning. Sooner or later, it would be their turn. That night, he showed her how to steady her aim. The rifle was heavy in her hands, but his guidance was firm, his voice low and patient. "Don't fight the weight," he said. "Let rest with you. Breathe with it." His hands brushed hers as he adjusted her grip, and for a moment she felt the warmth of connection beneath the cold steel. She fired, the shot cracking through the night air, and though she missed, he only nodded. "You'll learn," he said, "and when the time comes, you'll be ready." Her heart raced not from fear, but from the strange power of that moment. For the first time, she was not a burden to be hidden away, but a partner in survival. The land had demanded strength, and with his guidance, she was beginning to find it within herself. The West was cruel, but it had no mercy for those who chose to stay helpless. With every practice shot, she shed another layer of the woman who once cried alone by the barn. Later, as they sat on the porch beneath a sky thick with stars, she asked quietly, "Do you think we'll last?" His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, his face unreadable. "No one lasts forever out here," he said. "But if we're together, we'll last long enough." It was not a promise of safety, but a promise of presence, and that, in the West, was more valuable than any oath. The prairie wind swept over them, carrying with it the scent of dust and rain. She leaned back, the rifle resting across her lap, the weight no longer foreign. She understood, then, that survival was not only about the battles fought with bullets and steel, but about the battles fought within. And tonight, beneath the vastness of the frontier, she realized she was no longer fighting alone. The following weeks carved their story deeper into the land. The farmhouse, once hollow and silent, began to carry the rhythm of two lives intertwined. She rose early, her hands steady as she lit the fire, and he worked the soil with renewed determination. Their days were filled with labor, their nights with silence, but it was a silence that no longer suffocated. It was shared, and in the West, shared silence was stronger than spoken words. Still, the shadows of danger loomed ever near. Travelers passing through brought tales of homesteads burned in the night, of women taken, of families vanishing into the dust. Fear was as much a part of the frontier as the wind itself. She listened to these whispers with her heart clenched tight, but she no longer trembled as before. She had a rifle now, and more importantly, she had the knowledge that someone trusted her to wield it. That trust gave her a strength no weapon alone could provide. One evening, as the sun sank blood-red against the horizon, they stood outside together, their eyes fixed on the distance. "Do you regret offering me your name?" she asked quietly, the weight of her question heavier than the rifle slung across her shoulder. He turned to her, his expression stern but his voice steady. "No, a man's name isn't worth much if it dies with him. Giving it to you meant it would live on." His words struck her like a hammer against steel. In the Old West, where graves outnumbered houses, legacy mattered more than gold. To carry his name was not just survival. It was to become part of something that could outlast the dust. She had thought herself nameless, forgotten by the world. But now, she understood that she carried more than a borrowed name. She carried his faith in her, and that was a burden she would defend with her life. The prairie wind howled that night, rattling the windows and shaking the barn doors. But inside the farmhouse, there was no fear. There was only resolve. They were no longer two lost souls drifting across the frontier. They were bound, not by chance but by choice. And in a land where choice often meant life or death, theirs had become a declaration of survival. The test came sooner than either of them expected. It began with smoke on the horizon, a black column rising like a warning into the sky. Raiders. Their shouts carried long before their faces appeared, cruel laughter tearing through the stillness of the plains. The farmer's jaw tightened as he loaded his shotgun. While she stood at his side, the rifle gripped tightly in her hands. The moment they had trained for, the moment she had feared, had arrived. Her breath came in shallow bursts as the riders drew closer, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. For a fleeting second, she wanted to run, to hide as she once had. But then she remembered the night at the barn, the moment he had given her a name when she had nothing. That memory steadied her. She was no longer the forgotten woman. She was someone worth standing for, and someone who must now stand. The first shots cracked through the air, sharp and merciless. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, her arms shaking as the kickback jolted through her body. A rider fell, and the shock of it sent her heart racing, but she did not falter. Beside her, the farmer fired steadily, each blast a shield against the chaos charging toward them. They were outnumbered, but together, they fought with the desperation of those who knew there was nothing else to lose. The battle raged like a storm. Horses screamed, gunfire echoed, and dust choked the air. She lost count of how many times she fired, how many times the recoil burned her shoulder raw. All she knew was that she did not stop. She could not stop. The farmhouse, the name she carried, the bond they had forged, it all depended on her resolve. And in that crucible of fire and smoke, she proved to herself that she was no longer a shadow hiding at the edge of survival. She was a force, fierce and unyielding. When the raiders finally retreated, the silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire had been. The ground was littered with broken bodies and smoking embers, but the farmhouse still stood. She lowered the rifle, her arms trembling, her breath ragged. When she turned to the farmer, his face bore the same exhaustion, but his eyes held something else, pride, and a deep, unspoken gratitude. They had fought, they had endured, and together, they had won. The days after the raid were heavy with silence, but it was not the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of survival, the quiet that followed a storm that could have destroyed everything but hadn't. She walked through the farmhouse, her fingers brushing the walls as though to remind herself it still stood. The scars of the attack were clear, broken fences, burned earth, yet each mark told the story of what they had defended. She no longer felt like a guest in that home. She had fought for it. It was hers as much as his. The farmer carried himself differently now. He had always been strong, but now his strength was no longer solitary. When he looked at her, there was no trace of the man who had once demanded a woman at his door. Instead, there was recognition, the understanding that she had become his equal, his partner in the harshest of lands. They did not need to speak it aloud. The West had a way of etching truth into silence. She, too, carried herself differently. The woman who once wept alone by the barn was gone. In her place stood someone who had faced fire, who had held her ground when the world tried to erase her. She bore the weight of the name he had given her, but she bore it not as a burden, as a crown. Every step she took, every task she performed, carried the unshakable knowledge that she was no longer nameless, no longer forgotten. As they rebuilt what had been damaged, she felt the strange certainty that hardship was not something to fear, but something that bound them tighter. In the Old West, comfort was a rare illusion. Struggle was the true constant, and those who survived did so because they endured it together. She had found her place not in promises of safety, but in the shared fight against the cruelty of the land. At night, when the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, she lay awake listening to the rhythm of his breath beside her. For the first time in years, she did not fear the morning. She welcomed it, because the dawn did not mean another day of wandering alone. It meant another day of standing, of fighting, of belonging. Seasons changed, and with them, so did their lives. The farmhouse became more than shelter. It became the symbol of two souls who had refused to break. Travelers who passed through spoke of the raid, of the farmer and the woman who had stood their ground against impossible odds. Their story began to spread quietly across the plains, whispered in saloons and trading posts, not as a tale of wealth or conquest, but as proof that even in the most merciless land, resilience could carve out a legacy. She often returned to the barn, the place where it had all begun. Sometimes she stood there in silence, remembering the night she had wept with nothing left to give. The same walls that had witnessed her despair now stood as a reminder of her strength. The woman who once hid in the shadows had been reborn in fire and grit. The barn was no longer a place of shame. It was the birthplace of her new life. The farmer, too, was transformed. His days were still filled with toil, his hands still raw from the soil, but there was a light in him that had not been there before. She had not only shared his name, she had given him back his purpose. Together, they were no longer two survivors clinging to existence. They were a force that the West itself had been forced to acknowledge. Their story was not perfect. The land was still cruel, storms still came without warning, and death always lingered just beyond the horizon. But perfection was never the promise of the Old West. What mattered was the choice they had made, again and again, to face the darkness not alone, but side by side. In that choice, they found something stronger than fear, hope. And so, their tale lived on, not as a love story wrapped in softness, but as a testament to endurance, courage, and the power of two broken souls who refused to let the West define their end. In the silence of the plains, their bond echoed louder than gunfire, carrying the truth that even in the harshest lands, belonging was the rarest treasure of all. The story of the woman who once cried alone beside the barn and the farmer who offered her his last name is more than a tale of the Old West. It is a reminder of the choices that shape us when the world gives us nothing but dust and silence. In a land where survival was often measured by strength alone, they discovered that true endurance came from standing together, from turning despair into defiance, and from finding belonging in the most unlikely of places. Their journey was not built on comfort, but on courage. What began as tears in the shadows of a barn grew into a bond strong enough to withstand fire, gunshots, and the cruelty of the prairie. They were not spared from hardship. The land gave them no favors. Yet they endured, not because life grew easier, but because they faced its storms side by side. And in the end, the name he offered her was no longer just a word. It was a legacy carried in sweat, in blood, and in the unshakable will to remain unbroken. Their story teaches us something timeless, that even in the harshest of places, what defines us is not what we lack, but what we choose to give. A name, a hand, a moment of trust. These are the sparks that turn loneliness into belonging and despair into hope. The Old West demanded sacrifice from all, but for those who dare to trust in one another, it also revealed treasures more valuable than land or gold: loyalty, resilience, and the strength of unity. And perhaps the most powerful reflection is this: each of us still stands at thresholds of our own. We all face nights where the silence feels heavier than the wind, where despair whispers that we are forgotten. But like her, we are given choices to walk away into the emptiness or to step forward and claim a place, a bond, a reason to keep fighting. The doors we choose to open may carry us into hardship, but they may also lead us into the belonging we never thought possible. If this story moved you, let it echo beyond this moment. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters as much as hers did that night. Support these stories by liking the video and subscribing to the channel, so together we can keep alive the lessons that the Old West carved into the hearts of those who lived it. Because in the end, their legacy reminds us of one truth we should never forget. Even in the darkest of places, we are never truly alone when we dare to stand together.